My name is Linda Harris. I am 68 years old, a retired school librarian, and a widow for just over a year. Most days, my life is simple. I water the plants on my balcony. I drink coffee with a mystery novel in my hands, and I turn on the radio to soften the silence that once belonged to my husband. Robert. I thought I had learned to live with quiet, but one afternoon, sitting in the waiting room at my doctor's office, that quiet shattered. My phone buzzed, and I glanced down. It was a message from my daughter, Caroline. A few short lines, typed without thought, without hesitation. She told me she had sold the family's beach house and Robert's old wristwatch. She added that she and her husband were leaving for a one-way cruise to the Caribbean. I froze in that chair. The sound of fluorescent lights above me suddenly too loud, too sharp. My hands trembled as I read her words again. The house by the shore rebuilt by Robert after a hurricane nearly destroyed it. Every nail hammered by his own hands. Every inch carrying the weight of our history. And the watch. That silver timepiece he wore every single day of our marriage. He had worn it while mowing the lawn, while cheering at Caroline's graduation, while holding our newborn granddaughter. Caroline had stripped away decades of love and memory with a single text. To her, it was just real estate and an old accessory. To me, it was everything. I called her right away, desperate to hear her voice, desperate for her to tell me it was all a mistake. But the call went straight to voicemail. That was the moment I realized this story wasn't about money or things. It was about something far heavier, the feeling of being erased by your own child. And that was only the beginning. I remember stepping outside the clinic that day, the October sky pressing down on me like it wanted to crush me flat. The phone still sat in my hand, heavy as stone. I tried calling Caroline again. This time, it rang, and when she finally answered, her voice came quick, distracted. She told me she was packing, as if it were just another errand on a list. I asked her about the house. I asked her about her father's watch. My throat felt raw just saying those words out loud. She brushed it off as if they were just objects. She said the market was good, that she and Derek needed a fresh start, that it was time to let go. She told me not to be dramatic, that I still had my apartment, that I would be fine. Then she hung up. The silence after that call was louder than any fight we could have had. I stood on the sidewalk, cars rushing past, wondering how the child I raised could treat our history like clutter to be tossed out. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the glow of streetlights blur in my tears. My mind kept drifting back to the Cape May house. It wasn't just wood and brick. It was where Robert taught Caroline to ride her bike along the boardwalk, running beside her until she pedaled free. It was where we tied balloons to the porch railings for birthdays, where Robert stood tall but tearful when we sent her off to college. It was where the hibiscus bloomed each summer and the floorboards creaked no matter how many times Robert tried to fix them. And the watch. That watch had ticked through every season of our marriage. Silver with a worn leather strap. It had marked graduations, holidays, even afternoons spent mowing the lawn. I used to tease him that the second hand moved with his heartbeat, steady and true. To Caroline, these things were assets. To me, they were memory itself. She had sold them as if she were selling off an old sofa or a used car. That cut deeper than I can explain. I tried to remind myself of the girl she used to be, the child who once ran barefoot through the sand, who would sit on Robert's shoulders, her little hands tangled in his hair. I told myself she didn't mean to be cruel, that maybe she was overwhelmed, chasing some vision of freedom. But then her words echoed again. It's just stuff, and I felt the sharp edge of betrayal. There's a kind of loneliness that comes when the person hurting you is the same person you spent decades protecting. I had lost Robert, and now it felt like I was losing the last connection to him through our daughter's careless choices. I realized something else too. This wasn't only about grief, it was about power. I had trusted Caroline with legal authority after Robert died, thinking it would help her manage things smoothly. I never imagined she would use that power to strip away the very things that held me together. By morning, my chest felt hollow. I walked into the bank Robert had worked at for most of his career, hoping someone there would tell me it was all a mistake. Instead, the manager confirmed what I already feared. The sale was legal. The funds had already been transferred. Caroline had full control. I left the bank with nothing but a stack of papers that felt like they belonged to a stranger's life, not mine. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. People with grocery bags, briefcases, smiles. My world had been dismantled, quietly and legally, by my own child. That was when the anger began to stir. Not wild, not loud, but steady, like coals glowing beneath ash. I realized I was not only grieving what I lost, I was grieving the daughter I thought I had, and I had no idea what to do next. But life has a way of forcing the next step, even when you think you can't take it. And soon, I would discover that Robert had left me more than memories. He had left me something I never expected. When the house and the watch were taken from me, what hurt the most wasn't the money or the legality of it. What broke me was knowing that the pieces of our life, Robert's life, my life, Caroline's childhood, were being treated like yard sale leftovers. The Cape May house had always been more than a building. I could still see Robert kneeling in the sand after the hurricane, his hands raw from work, but his spirit steady. He hammered every nail like it was a promise that our family wasn't broken, that we could withstand storms together. I used to watch him from the porch as the waves rolled in behind him, the salt wind tangling his hair, his jaw set in that stubborn way that meant he would finish what he started. That house wasn't just rebuilt wood, it was Robert himself, poured into every board, and inside its walls lived our story. I could close my eyes and hear the squeak of the back hallway floor that never stopped no matter how many times Robert tried to fix it. I could smell the grilled corn drifting across the deck on summer nights. I could picture Caroline wobbling down the boardwalk on her bike, Robert jogging beside her, shouting encouragement until she finally pedaled free on her own. I carried those memories in my chest as if they were carved into me. And then there was the watch. That simple silver wristwatch with a worn strap that molded to his skin. Robert wore it at birthdays, graduations, even while mowing the lawn on hot afternoons. He used to joke that it was his shadow, always ticking, always steady. I loved hearing that faint tick when he held my hand at night. It was like sleeping beside time itself. Caroline never understood. To her, it was a market opportunity. To me, it was the heartbeat of my marriage, the rhythm of 40 years together. When she dismissed it as just stuff, something inside me cracked. I thought about the day Robert slipped the watch off for the last time. When the hospital handed it back to me in a plastic bag with his wedding ring, I remember sitting alone in the parking lot that night, holding it tight in my palm, whispering to myself that I still had a piece of him. That tiny ticking circle of metal became my anchor, a reminder that love does not vanish, it just changes form. Now it was gone. And the house, too. The anchors that had steadied me after Robert's death were cut away, and I was left adrift. It's strange how grief works. You think you've faced the worst when you bury your husband? You believe nothing can hurt that deeply again? But when your own child erases the places and objects that carried your shared life, the wound cuts even sharper. That night, sitting in my apartment, staring at the dark window, I realized I had reached a crossroads. I could let this betrayal harden me, or I could try to hold on to something else, something Robert left me that couldn't be sold. His lessons, his strength, his voice that used to tell me, in the hardest times, that storms always pass. I didn't yet know that Robert had left me more than just memories. He had left me a lifeline, one I hadn't seen until I was desperate enough to reach for it. The morning after I learned what Caroline had done, I forced myself to walk into the bank where Robert had spent most of his career. The marble floors, the polished counters, they had always made me feel safe, like I was stepping into a place where order still existed. I clung to that hope as I waited to speak with the manager, a man who had known Robert for years. But as he explained the situation, I felt the floor shift under me. Caroline had durable power of attorney. She had used it to authorize the sale, and everything she had signed was completely legal. The money was already gone, transferred to accounts I couldn't touch. I sat there gripping the edge of his desk, trying to steady myself as he told me, gently, that there was nothing to reverse. I walked out of the bank with a folder of papers I didn't even want to look at. The sun was too bright, the world too loud. People hurried down the sidewalk with grocery bags, briefcases, little children tugging at their arms. Their lives kept moving forward, untouched. Mine had been dismantled quietly, on paper, by my own child. Later that afternoon, I met with a young attorney, thinking maybe he would have an answer. He explained, in careful terms, that challenging Caroline would be costly and slow. Unless I could prove fraud, the law would stand by her side. His words landed like stones in my chest. By the time I got home, I was numb. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the photo of Robert in his work suit, the tie crooked as it always was. I whispered to him in my head, asking how it had come to this. I had believed that love would guide our daughter, that she would treat our history with care. Instead, she used the very authority I had given her as a weapon against me. That night, I realized something frightening. It wasn't just about losing the house and the watch. It was about being powerless, about having trusted someone who saw my grief as an opportunity instead of a responsibility. I felt cornered, trapped with no way out. Yet deep down, I remembered Robert's steady voice telling me in harder times that I was never truly without choices. I just hadn't found mine yet. And soon, I would discover that he had prepared for this moment long before I ever imagined needing it. That night, after the weight of the lawyer's words settled into my chest, I found myself sitting at my dresser. My hands drifted toward the back of the drawer, to the small velvet box and a sealed envelope Robert had given me before he passed. He had said only one thing when he handed it to me, that I should open it if I ever felt cornered. At the time, I laughed it off. Robert had always been the practical one, the man with backup plans tucked away like folded maps. I never believed I would need it, but that night, I was desperate. I broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside was his careful handwriting, steady even in his final months, He wrote that if I was reading these words, life had become harder than I expected. He reminded me that I was not powerless, that I should never forget my own strength. Alongside the letter were documents, account numbers, property deeds, and papers for an LLC I had never heard of. To my shock, the company owned the very building where Caroline and Derek lived. I sat there stunned, staring at the evidence that Robert had prepared for a future he somehow knew might test me. He had hidden these assets in my name, ensuring that no matter what happened, I would never be without leverage. For the first time since Caroline's message, I felt something stirring in me that wasn't just grief. It was power. I had choices. I could use what Robert left me to crush Caroline and Derek, to strip away their comfort the way they had stripped away mine. A part of me longed for that kind of justice. But another part of me, softer but stronger, reminded me of Robert's words through the years: strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it guides, teaches, and rebuilds. That night, I realized I didn't want to destroy my daughter. I wanted her to understand what she had done, to learn responsibility, to grow into someone Robert would have been proud of. And now, thanks to Robert, I had a way to make that lesson real. What came next would test not only my resolve, but the very definition of mercy. Once I understood what Robert had left me, the fog that had weighed me down began to lift. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't trapped. I still had the ability to act, and more than that, I had the responsibility to use it wisely. The very next morning, I sat in the office of a different attorney. She was older, sharp-eyed, and steady in her words. I laid everything before her: the message from Caroline, the sale of the house, the bank's confirmation, and finally Robert's envelope with the hidden deeds and company papers. She didn't look surprised. Instead, she studied the documents with the calm of someone who had seen many storms before. Then she told me the truth I hadn't been able to see through my grief. I was not as cornered as I thought. Within days, things began to change. My daughter's durable power of attorney was revoked, her misuse of trust documented in detail. The sale of the Cape May house was stalled and pushed into review. No longer something she could walk away from easily. But the boldest move was the simplest: a 30-day notice delivered to Caroline and Derek's door. They had believed the luxury condo was theirs. They had built their lives around it. But the truth was written in black and white: it had never belonged to them. It was held by the Harper Family LLC, and I was its sole member. When that notice slid under their door, the silence that followed spoke louder than any argument. For the first time, the balance had shifted. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't gloat. What I felt was clarity. Caroline had treated our family's history like clutter, had dismissed love and sacrifice as things to be cashed in. And now, she would have to face the reality that her choices carried consequences. When she finally stood at my door, pale and shaken, eviction notice in hand, I looked into her eyes and saw something new. Not arrogance, not dismissal, but fear, the first crack in the wall she had built between us. I knew then that Robert's plan wasn't about revenge. It was about giving me the chance to draw the line, to show Caroline that love without respect cannot survive. This was not the end of our story. It was the beginning of her lesson. When Caroline finally came to me, shaken by the eviction notice and stripped of the certainty she had always carried, I felt no joy in her fear. I didn't want her destroyed. I wanted her to learn. Robert's voice lingered in my heart, reminding me that consequences should guide, not crush. So instead of cutting her off completely, I placed choices in front of her. If she wished to keep any roof over her head, she would have to live differently. The lavish condo would be gone. Instead, she and Derek would move into a modest apartment I owned. The rent would be manageable, but nothing would be free. Derek would need documented employment, not vague schemes or promises of opportunities. And Caroline, she would need to give her time. Volunteering at the senior center every week. 12 hours. No excuses. These were not punishments. They were boundaries. Firm lines drawn so she could finally see the difference between freedom and irresponsibility. For the first time, Caroline had to understand that life is not sustained by taking, but by showing up, by giving, by building trust through action. The first weeks were rough. She resisted, rolled her eyes, carried her pride like armor. But when she stepped into that senior center, surrounded by people who had nothing to offer her except their stories, something inside her began to shift. I saw it in her updates, in the way her words softened. She began to braid an old woman's hair. She learned to listen to a veteran repeat the same memory 3 times. She knelt beside strangers with patience I hadn't thought she possessed. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was a start. And that small beginning gave me hope that Robert's faith in her, and in me, had not been wasted. Just when I thought Robert's envelope had given me all the strength I needed, life placed another secret in my hands. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through boxes of old tax papers and faded photographs, I found another envelope tucked away at the bottom of a chest. My name was written across it in his familiar, steady hand. Opening it felt like reopening a wound, yet also like being handed a gift. Inside was a deed to a small plot of land on the edge of Seabrook, not far from where we once spent summers. Alongside it was a note from Robert, written with the same clarity he had always carried. He told me that if I was reading this, the first storm had already passed. He believed that one day Caroline and I would need something new to build, not just something to repair. I sat there stunned, listening to the rain tapping against the windows, reading his words again and again. He had seen further ahead than I ever could have imagined. He didn't just prepare for emergencies. He dreamed of a future where his family, even in its brokenness, could create something lasting. When I showed the deed to Caroline, she stared at it in disbelief. I told her gently that this was not about money or pride. It was about redemption. Robert wanted us to build something together, something that gave back. That's when the idea of Harbor House was born. We visited the land the following weekend. The grass was damp, the air filled with salt and pine, the horizon wide and open. For the first time in years, I saw something soften in Caroline. She began sketching ideas, asking questions about rooms, gardens, accessibility. The woman who once chased cruises and luxuries was suddenly thinking about wide hallways for wheelchairs and a reading nook by the window. I realized Robert had given us more than a deed. He had given us a bridge, a way to turn betrayal into purpose, grief into hope. Standing there with my daughter, looking out at the water, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. I felt possibility. Months later, Harbor House finally opened its doors. The scent of fresh paint and cedar still lingered in the halls, sunlight spilling through wide windows that looked out toward the sea. On the walls hung photographs of Robert, quiet reminders of the man who had built the foundation for all of this, even if he wasn't here to see it. The first residents arrived slowly, a retired teacher, two widows, a grandfather whose family lived far away. Caroline carried their bags, guided them to their rooms, and listened to their stories as if each word mattered. Watching her, I felt something shift inside me. This was not the same daughter who once sold away our memories for a quick escape. This was someone learning the weight of love, the power of responsibility, the quiet dignity of service. Standing on the porch beside her that evening, the ocean rolling steady in front of us, I realized that broken things can be rebuilt, not into what they once were, but into something stronger, something new. Caroline turned to me, her voice softer than it had been in years, and admitted she could never undo what she had done. But she wanted to honor her father and me by building something lasting. I didn't need an apology in words. This was her apology action, not promises. As the waves echoed like a heartbeat, I felt peace wash over me. Harbor House was not just a building. It was proof that betrayal does not have to be the final chapter. It can be the soil where redemption grows. And maybe that's the lesson I leave with you. Sometimes mercy doesn't mean forgetting, and consequences don't have to mean destruction. They can be a bridge, a way forward, a chance to build again. If this story touched you, share it. Someone out there may need to be reminded that storms can be survived, and love, when guided with boundaries, can still heal what once was broken.